Greetings, everyone. My name is Tyler James Berger, and welcome to the CoSM Podcast. I recently had the joy of interviewing David Yaden, a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Working in the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, David's focus is on the psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and psychopharmacology of transcendent experiences. David is the editor of Rituals and Practices in World Religions, and his scientific and scholarly work has been covered by outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Please welcome David Yaden. All right, I'm here with David Yaden. David, thank you so much for coming onto the CoSM Podcast. It's an honor to speak with you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and how you got interested in this field?
That's a big question. I'll try to cut to the chase. Although I'll bring you back to my undergrad years, lying in my dorm room bed. This is completely sober, completely spontaneous context. Really came out of nowhere. I felt a kind of a heat in my chest, which at first I thought was heartburn or indigestion or something, so I sort of ignored it. But this heat spread, eventually encompassing my entire body, and the intensity kept going up. And so at some point, a voice in my mind, or my mind, spoke and said, this is love. At that point, I became unaware of my body, or left my body or went into my mind and saw boundaryless horizons stretching out all around me, and this kind of intricate fabric that I was fully part of and was me, and I was part of, and that feeling of love or heat just increased to the boiling point. And after probably just a few minutes, but what felt like days, I opened my eyes and my body was laughing and crying at the same time. So this resulted in a feeling of a pulse of love where I just wanted to, the classic thing, call my family and friends and tell them that I love them. And just everything seemed new and the future was rich with possibilities. But overall, more than anything, I was wondering what the fuck just happened to me. And that question motivated many years of study and continues to motivate me today. And so I studied in comparative religion, in philosophy, eventually leading to neuroscience and psychology. I did my PhD in psychology, where I also studied some neuroscience. And now I'm in a psychopharmacology lab studying psychedelics at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research.
Wow. Yeah. So it all really started with you having a primary religious experience, you could call it.
Yeah. And people call it a lot of different things. I think religious experience or spiritual experience is the most culturally normative way of thinking about it. These are the words that come to mind first for most people. And they certainly did for me. I had no idea what happened to me, as I said, and one of the first books that really helped me to understand that I wasn't going crazy was William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience, where in this book, he includes many dozens of accounts of people who had experiences similar to mine in many, many ways. And so in this book, William James, who was an early American philosopher and experimental psychologist, basically proposes, hey, let's study these scientifically. Let's study these experiences and bring these experiences that seem strange and seem sort of beyond our normal psychological framework, let's acknowledge that some questions will probably not be answerable through science. They're more questions for philosophy or theology. Let's set those aside and let's focus on the questions that we can address using scientific methods, like what tends to trigger these experiences, what's going on in people's brains and their bodies during them, what are they experiencing subjectively, what differences are there, what similarities are there, and how do they affect our lives? Are they generally negative? Are they associated with mental illness, which is what Freud thought? Are they always positive and healing, like what Carl Jung thought? Or is it somewhere in the middle, which is what William James landed on? And although he did say that these experiences are generally quite positive, and that's supported by the data today. So these experiences, whether you want to call them religious, spiritual, mystical, self-transcendent, peak. I see you nodding there. These are somewhat synonymous terms, but a large percentage of the population will describe having had one of these experiences, and the vast majority of people end up benefiting tremendously from them. And I find that fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's many aspects of religion that one could approach with using the scientific method. There are the belief systems, there's the scripture, there's the symbolism of any given religion. But something that you've done quite a bit of research on is the psychology of ritual. And I'm wondering if you could. I'm wondering how you would define religious ritual and what important functions and benefits it offers to people both individually and in group settings.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my research of these experiences, one of the primary triggers that kept coming up over and over and over again were religious rituals and practices. And so, it's difficult to define these terms. People define them a bit differently in different contexts. I usually think about rituals as a step-by-step embodied process that is shared among some community. So pretty broad definition there. I think rituals in practical terms are usually done in a group setting, whereas I think about practices as something that can be done more individually. So an example of a ritual would be, a drum circle with dancing. It involves this kind of communal element to it. Whereas an example of a practice might be prayer or meditation, where you can do it in a group or you can do it on your own. And the thing that really spurred me to be interested in these is, why are these such common triggers of these very powerful experiences? The other thing that interested me was we've studied scientifically some practices a lot, but there are so many rituals and practices out there that haven't been studied. So mindfulness is an example of a very well-studied practice. There's been a pretty good amount of psychology and neuroscience and clinical research on mindfulness meditation, which is great. I love this research. But when I go out into the world and see the rich tapestry of everything that people are doing in terms of major world religions or just in terms of intentional communities, I was really struck by how little we know about the potential benefits of all of these vast array of rituals and practices. So one thing that I did last year, this took several years to complete, but was finally published, was a few of us scientists, neuroscientists and physicians reached out to scholars of religion. And we approached scholars of religion from every major world religion including humanism and Unitarian Universalism. So I think it was 20 religions or traditions that we approached. And we asked them, what are a few group rituals or individual practices that are kind of like mindfulness in a way, where they're well described, a lot of people could practice them, and they could be studied scientifically. And so that resulted in a book, Rituals and Practices in World Religions. And hopefully now scientists have at least a start where they can say, okay, here's a number of rituals and practices that we can look at. But of course, the book should be much, much bigger. There's so many communities engaging in all kinds of fascinating rituals and practices. Like you mentioned, the full moon ritual. And this is something that I very much doubt anyone has studied, but there are probably so many fascinating psychological and neurobiological components to it. Actually, I'd be really interested to hear more about it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems that ritual is a way, and you've written about this a little bit too. It's a way for a group of people to stabilize a shared identity. And the full moon is a reason for people to gather, and it's something that we all have in common, no matter what background you're from, no matter what religion you practice. The moon is full. We are all under the moon, and it's a very universal reason for meeting. And it allows a group of people it provides social cohesion in a way. It creates community. And you've written it a little bit about Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that idea a little bit, because I think it's what at least CoSM practicing the full moon is all about.
Yeah. I love that word, collective effervescence. It's just like this sort of airy substance that feels like it's surrounding you in these ritual contexts. It's when we think about ritual, we think about exiting the normal structured social life of a society, of any society, and entering ritual space where a lot of these hierarchies and structures become flattened. And so it doesn't matter, what you do for a living, how much you make, what you look like, all of those things at least are meant to be left outside of that space. And so you're connecting on some kind of basic level. And I think Durkheim's term collective effervescence refers to this kind of collective air that we all become a part of. And so, yeah, Durkheim's view, and this is a French sociologist who studied Aboriginal culture and a number of different rituals across many countries, talked about how every society needs to have these coming togethers, these cyclical moments where we can come together, reaffirm our connectedness, and then go back out into our distinct social roles and the hierarchies and the systems and all of those things. And so he wasn't saying collapse all of it and just do ritual all the time. He wasn't saying do away with ritual, but he's saying ritual is a fundamental part of the rhythm of any functioning society. Durkheim was a little bit different, I think, than some other theorists who emphasized more so enacting beliefs. And so a lot of, like Max Weber was this other guy who was somewhat of a contemporary of Durkheim. And he thought it was all about reaffirming particular doctrines or beliefs. And I think you'll see those kinds of rituals also at play. And in these kinds of rituals, being a believer in a particular doctrine is a prerequisite to be part of the ritual. Whereas I think Durkheim's conception allows for a more pluralistic view where you can believe, different people can believe different things and still come together in a community. And it sounds like from what you're saying that the full moon ritual is more of this kind of Durkheimian sense, where it's this felt sense of connectedness rather than reaffirming a particular doctrine or belief.
Yeah, totally. And, something else you write about is the self and social regulation approach, that coming into these rituals, it has benefits for the individual and for the group in this kind of regulatory psychological function. And I'm wondering, what what does the science have to say on any kind of quantitative health benefits to being a part of a religious ritual or having a religious practice?
So it's a difficult thing to study because it's really hard to make people who don't attend rituals for long periods of time. Right? So it's hard to do like a well-controlled study. But over many decades, it's been observed that people who do have a common regular practice, like prayer or meditation, as well as people who have, say, a weekly or monthly group that they engage in. Specifically, most of the research is on, attending religious services, for example, and prayer. There's definitely a correlation with health. So we don't know what exactly that's caused by. It could just be that healthier people in general tend to do these things. But it's a compelling relationship. And I think some of the mindfulness literature has shown to some extent that there's probably a causal link where if you engage intentionally with a daily practice, you can expect some benefit to your health and your well-being. I think a decent proportion of that probably has to do with stress relief. I mean, people are very stressed nowadays. I think a lot of us are feeling overwhelmed and overloaded. And a practice or a ritual allows you to set all that stuff aside and breathe a sigh of relief, because you have some time set aside where you're not just ruminating on your worries and your to-do list. And so I think that can be really powerful. And so in terms of what you mentioned, like not just the health related outcomes, the other kinds of outcomes, there's some really interesting psychology of ritual. So it seems like when people are acutely stressed, they will spontaneously engage in rituals or practices essentially of their own making, or ones that they've learned before. So the classic example of this is, watch a Major League Baseball player when they're getting up to bat. They have so many of these bizarre, well, maybe not bizarre, but unique rituals. And I mean, you can even see this in Little League. You can see just kids spontaneously doing this stuff. And, it's an anxious or stressful moment. You're about to perform. And so it seems like we just spontaneously start to engage in practices and rituals when we're stressed. And there might be a good reason for that, which is performing a practice or ritual reduces your stress and enhances performance on average. And so if you actually get people to engage in some kind of practice or ritual in an acutely stressful moment, they will afterwards be a bit more relaxed and tend to perform a little bit better.
Yeah, so that is ritual as a way of regulating the self. These little things that maybe a baseball player will do right before they hit the field. And I think that is a great kind of proof to this idea that there is a natural and innate human craving for ritual. And that when we don't receive kind of carefully constructed rituals from our cultural traditions, we will create our own. And it seems like you see this a lot with, it seems like the rituals we have now is, get your driver's license when you're 18, go out drinking when you're 21, or maybe these are even more particularly considered rites of passage, which is a form of ritual.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Traditionally, rites of passage had this very immersive element to them. You would enter this ritual space that has this kind of flattening effect socially, like I mentioned, where you'll all wear exactly the same thing, for example. And sometimes you don't even use your normal name. And you do generally pretty difficult or unusual practices, which I think were likely done in order to induce altered states of consciousness. And when you look around today, we don't really have this. I mean, when you graduate, there's some elements. You're all wearing the same thing. But basically, you're just sitting in a field for a couple of hours and it's really boring. There's no altered state of consciousness there. I mean, boot camp, everyone wears the same thing. You refer to yourself in the third person, but it's not as if people are going into altered states of consciousness generally in that setting. So it's really rare to see rites of passage now that involve these traditional elements, at least that were traditional in many cultures. And it might be that we crave that on some level and seek to create these altered states of consciousness in unhealthy ways, like you mentioned, going out and binge drinking, or engaging in all kinds of reckless behavior in order maybe to induce some kind of altered state. And in many cases, this is done in such an unhealthy way, in a really dangerous way in our society. And so I think you're right that rites of passage are an important part of this conversation. And, it's not, I think rites of passage have varied in their effectiveness and their safety across a lot of cultures. But it doesn't seem like we have a very good one set up for our young people in our society.
Yeah, I mean, if we are inevitably going to seek out ritual and practices, either consciously or unconsciously, I think it's better that we do it consciously, to bring some intention and design to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm not sure the extent to which we all need ritual and practice. I think there's this tendency to create it. There's this tendency to develop if it's not there, or to adopt it from meaning-making frameworks. But I think some people need it more than others. For example, with mindfulness meditation, the people who seem to benefit most are people who have slightly elevated levels of stress and anxiety. And, I'm probably one of those people who do benefit from it. I'm probably one of these people who needs these things a bit more. So I meditate every morning before I start working, and integrating that practice into my life has just improved my well-being tremendously, in order to, quiet the worries and the ruminations, and to kind of focus on my values and what's really important that day. Has really, I don't want to say transformed my life, but it's made my life substantially better. And so I think it's important that people learn about these options for themselves. When I first learned to meditate, I was actually angry that no one had taught me to meditate earlier, because it provided me this way to regulate what's going on in my mind, and to connect with my values, connect with other people around me, just by sitting there in a chair for 20 minutes. It felt like it really improved things for me.
Yeah, that seems to be a quality of ritual. It seems to be an anchor for our spiritual experience. And one saying that I really love is that spirituality is fire and religion is the fireplace. So I think that a lot of people, have that spiritual fire. Maybe they had a mystical experience or, an experience of the sacred. And what they find in religion are these rituals that actually help them uh, give some kind of structure and some kind of anchor to that otherwise boundless spiritual fire, so they can root that spirituality into something that can be done in a daily practice. And then that practice then reminds them and brings them back to that sacred place inside of themselves.
Yeah, I think that that has been a traditional function, absolutely. And I think now, here and there, we're starting to find novel ways as well for integrating these kinds of experiences in an ongoing way that aren't necessarily religious, but do involve some kind of community. And from a scientific perspective, I think we're just beginning to learn how to help people integrate these kinds of experiences. I mean, for a long time in my work, I've just been focused on trying to normalize these experiences to show people they're not alone in having had one. There's some really amazing data from Gallup, like these big survey polling companies, where they ask people every few years, have you had a life-changing religious or spiritual experience? And they'll phrase it differently every few years, but pretty consistently, 30 to 40% of the population will say, yes, I completely agree. I've definitely had a religious or spiritual or mystical experience. And depending on how you phrase it, those estimates will differ a little bit. But the major point is something like 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 people has had one of these experiences. And what's also amazing is most of these people have never told anyone about it. So most people who've had these experiences don't want to share it with other people, probably because they're afraid of being judged, or they think that people will think that they're crazy. And I think that this is part of a Freudian hangover, where Freud thought that these experiences indicated mental illness. And for some reason, that view has persisted, I think, in society. Whereas the data don't support that at all. And in fact, most people benefit tremendously from these experiences. So a big thing that I want to do is just normalize the fact that a lot of people have had these profoundly meaningful altered states of consciousness, and they're not alone in that. And they could probably benefit even more if we were able to find a way to integrate these experiences in an ongoing way, perhaps with rituals and practices.
Yeah, well, this is why CoSM returns to the ritual of celebrating the full moon every month. It's a ritual that where we can have ritual, but we can also be radically welcoming. Like I said, it's the full moon for everyone, and it's a reason to celebrate, no matter who you are. And David, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about this today. I hope to see you at a full moon someday in the future.
It sounds really intriguing. I'd like to check it out. And thanks so much for having me on. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
For sure. And can you tell us a little bit about where people can find you, or if people want to learn more, where would you direct them?
Sure. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at ExistWell. And I do have a website called varietiescorpus.com where you can report any kind of self-transcendent, spiritual, mystical, or awe-inspiring experience that you may have had triggered by anything. And that will help our research into these experiences.
Great. David, thank you so much for coming on the CoSM Podcast.
Thanks again. So long.
Thanks again for listening to the CoSM Podcast. Learn more about David by following the links in the description to this video. And while you're at it, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, hit that notification bell, and follow CoSM on Facebook and Instagram. The CoSM Shop is filled with sacred gifts and literature for any art enthusiast. Thank you for taking a stand for the future of CoSM and its mission, to build an enduring sanctuary of visionary art that uplifts a global community. See you next time.